The autumn wind swept through Chicago's streets as Nathaniel Brooks's sleek black Mercedes pulled up to St. Mary's Orphanage. At 42, Nathaniel had everything money could buy: a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, a successful investment firm, and more wealth than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. Yet something felt empty as he straightened his Italian silk tie and stepped onto the cracked concrete sidewalk. The orphanage director, Mrs. Martinez, greeted him with practiced enthusiasm. "Mr. Brooks, thank you for considering our institution for your annual charity donation." Her weathered face carried the strain of running an underfunded facility, but her eyes remained sharp and observant. Nathaniel nodded, following her through dim hallways that smelled of industrial cleaner and old books. Children's artwork dotted the walls, crayon drawings of houses, families, and dreams that hadn't come true. Mrs. Martinez led him past classrooms where kids sat at worn desks, their heads bent over schoolwork. "We currently house 43 children," Mrs. Martinez explained, her shoes clicking against the linoleum. "Ages range from 4 to 17. Many have been with us for years." She paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in. They reached the recreation room, where scattered groups of children played board games or read books. Nathaniel's attention immediately caught on a boy sitting alone by the window. The child, around 12 years old, was focused intently on a drawing pad, his hand moving with careful precision across the paper. Nathaniel stopped walking. His heart seemed to skip several beats. The boy had the same high cheekbones Nathaniel saw in his mirror every morning. The same strong jaw, though softened by youth. The same determined set to his mouth when concentrating. Even the way he held his head, slightly tilted to the right while focusing, it was like watching a younger version of himself. "Who is that?" Nathaniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Martinez consulted her mental records. "That's Jamal. He's been with us for about 3 years now. Quite talented with art, it's his escape, I suppose." Nathaniel moved closer, drawn by an inexplicable force. The boy looked up as shadows fell across his paper. Dark brown eyes, different from Nathaniel's blue ones, met his gaze. But the shape, the intensity of that look, it was uncanny. "Hello," Nathaniel said, his usual confident tone wavering slightly. "May I see what you're drawing?" Jamal hesitated, then turned his sketchpad around. It was a detailed cityscape of Chicago, drawn from memory, with remarkable attention to architectural details. "I saw it from the field trip last week," he explained. His voice was quiet but clear. "This is impressive," Nathaniel said, meaning it. "Do you draw often?" "Whenever I can." Jamal shrugged, but his eyes lit up at the praise. "I want to be an architect someday. Design buildings that make people's lives better." The conversation flowed naturally, despite the strange tension Nathaniel felt. Jamal spoke about his life at the orphanage, the daily routines, his friendship with younger kids, his struggles with math but love for art and science. Each gesture, each expression seemed to mirror Nathaniel's own mannerisms. As they talked, Mrs. Martinez quietly excused herself, leaving them engaged in conversation. Jamal shared his dreams of college, of creating spaces that could change communities. His maturity struck Nathaniel. Here was a child who had faced adult realities far too early, yet maintained hope. When the visit ended, Nathaniel found himself reluctant to leave. He'd come to make a donation, to fulfill a social obligation. Instead, he'd found a mystery that would haunt his thoughts. That night, in his luxurious penthouse, Nathaniel couldn't shake the image of Jamal from his mind. He poured himself a glass of scotch and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights flicker below. The resemblance was too strong to be coincidence. But what did it mean? And why did he feel such an immediate connection to this child? Sleep eluded him as questions multiplied in his mind. His family's past had always seemed straightforward, privileged, wealthy, uncomplicated. But now, looking at his reflection in the darkened window, he saw Jamal's face overlaid with his own, and knew something deeper was at work. The following morning, Nathaniel called his office to clear his schedule. His executive assistant, Sarah, expressed surprise. In 15 years, he'd never taken an unexpected day off. But the need to understand the connection with Jamal consumed him. He started at the city records office, a brutalist concrete building downtown. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses hanging from a chain, raised her eyebrows at his request for Brooks' family records from the past 20 years. The old records are in the basement archive, she explained, leading him down a narrow staircase. Most people just request digital copies now. The basement smelled of old paper and dust, with rows of metal filing cabinets stretching into dim corners. Hours passed as Nathaniel combed through documents. Birth certificates, death records, property deeds, the usual paper trail of a wealthy family. Nothing unusual stood out. His own birth certificate listed his parents clearly, Richard and Elizabeth Brooks, both from old-money Chicago families. Next, he visited his Aunt Margaret, his father's sister, in her Lake Forest mansion. She sat in her sunroom, surrounded by expensive orchids, stirring sugar into her tea with a silver spoon. "Why this sudden interest in family history?" she asked, watching him carefully over her cup. "Just trying to understand our roots better," Nathaniel replied, keeping his voice casual. "Were there any other Brooks children in my generation?" Aunt Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she set down her cup. "What an odd question. Your father was an only child, as you know. And I never had children. What about cousins? More distant relatives?" "None that I recall." Her voice turned sharp. "Really, Nathaniel, shouldn't you be focusing on your business rather than digging up the past?" Her defensive reaction only heightened his suspicion. As he left, he noticed her immediately reaching for her phone. She was warning someone. Back at his penthouse, Nathaniel pulled out old family photo albums. He studied faces across generations, looking for any clue that might explain Jamal's existence. In one dusty album, a photograph slipped out, his mother in her youth, standing in front of a Chicago hospital. The date stamp showed it was about a year before his birth. She looked troubled, not facing the camera directly. Then came the breakthrough. While going through his father's old desk, maintained exactly as it had been before his death 5 years ago, Nathaniel found a hidden compartment. Inside lay a single envelope, yellowed with age, addressed to his father in his mother's handwriting. The letter was dated just months before Nathaniel's birth. "Richard, I can't keep hiding this. The guilt is eating me alive. What I did, it wasn't right. There must be another way to handle this situation. Every time I think about the other dash." The letter ended there, torn off mid-sentence. Nathaniel's hands shook as he reread the fragment. What situation? What had his parents hidden? He tried calling his mother, who was traveling in Europe, but got her voicemail. His text messages went unanswered. The wall of silence around his questions grew higher. Returning to St. Mary's Orphanage, Nathaniel requested to see Jamal's file. Mrs. Martinez hesitated, citing privacy regulations, but Nathaniel's status as a major donor, and his obvious distress, swayed her. The file was thin. Jamal had been left at the orphanage 3 years ago by a woman who provided minimal information. No birth certificate. No medical history. Just a first name and an estimated birth date. The woman seemed afraid, Mrs. Martinez recalled, watching Nathaniel's face carefully. She said Jamal would be safer here. We reported it to authorities, of course, but nothing came of the investigation. Nathaniel stared at the sparse documentation, frustration building. Every answer led to more questions. Why did his family become defensive at simple questions about the past? What was in the rest of his mother's letter? Who was Jamal's mother, and why did she feel he needed protection? That night, unable to sleep, Nathaniel made a decision. He would confront his mother directly, force her to explain the secrets that seemed to shadow his family. But first, he needed to understand more about Jamal himself, not just as a mystery to solve, but as a person who might be connected to him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The weight of unspoken truths pressed down on him as he watched the sunrise over Lake Michigan. Whatever he discovered next would change lives forever, his own, Jamal's, and perhaps many others. After 3 days of unanswered calls, Elizabeth Brooks finally responded to Nathaniel's messages. She agreed to meet him at her Chicago townhouse, cutting her European trip short. When Nathaniel arrived, he found her in the sitting room, composed but tense, her silver hair perfectly styled and her posture rigid. "You're causing quite a stir with all these questions," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Margaret called me, quite concerned." Nathaniel sat across from her, noting how her fingers gripped the armchair. "I met someone at St. Mary's Orphanage," he said directly. "A boy named Jamal. He looks exactly like me at that age. Elizabeth's face paled, but she maintained her composure. Many people can look similar, darling. It's hardly worth dash. I found your letter to Dad, Nathaniel interrupted. The one about guilt and hiding something. Stop avoiding the truth, Mother. Who is Jamal? Silence filled the room. Elizabeth stood and walked to the window, her back to her son. Minutes passed before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. It was 1981, she began. I was young, just finished with college. Your father and I weren't married yet, but our families had practically arranged everything. She paused, collecting herself. I met someone else. A young man who worked at the university library. Thomas. He was different from anyone I'd ever known. Nathaniel watched his mother's shoulders tense. Different how? He was black, for one thing, she said, finally turning to face him. Brilliant, kind, passionate about literature and art. We fell in love. My family would have never accepted it. His family warned him about getting involved with someone like me. The implications started to dawn on Nathaniel. Did you? I got pregnant, Elizabeth continued, her voice strengthening. Thomas and I planned to run away together. But then your grandfather found out. He threatened to ruin Thomas's life, his family's lives. He had the power to do it, too. She returned to her seat, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Your grandfather gave me an ultimatum. End things with Thomas, marry your father as planned, or watch Thomas's family lose everything they'd worked for. Their business, their home, their reputation. What happened to the baby? Nathaniel asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. I gave birth in secret. Your grandfather arranged everything. The baby was given up for adoption immediately. I never even held him. Tears started falling down Elizabeth's cheeks. 2 months later, I married your father. You were born the following year. Nathaniel's world tilted on its axis. So Jamal must be my first son's child. Your half-brother's son. Elizabeth wiped her eyes. The resemblance you saw, it's because you're his uncle. Where is my half-brother now? Have you tried to find him? Elizabeth shook her head. The adoption was closed, the record sealed. Your grandfather made sure of that. After your father died, I hired a private investigator, but they found nothing. The trail was too old, too well hidden. And Thomas? He left Chicago shortly after. I heard he moved to California, but I never contacted him. It would have only caused more pain. She reached for Nathaniel's hand. I know you must hate me now. Nathaniel pulled away, standing up. I don't hate you, Mother. But I'm angry. You let your father's racism and threats destroy multiple lives. You kept this secret for decades while an entire branch of our family was out there, unknown. What are you going to do? Elizabeth asked, fear creeping into her voice. First, I'm going to find out everything I can about Jamal's situation. Then, I'm going to try to locate my half-brother. Nathaniel moved toward the door, then paused. And Mother. It's time for all the secrets to come out. No more hiding. As he left the townhouse, Nathaniel's mind raced with implications. Somewhere out there was his half-brother, Jamal's father, unaware of his own history. And Jamal himself, an innocent child caught in the web of decades-old decisions and prejudices. The truth had finally emerged, but it was only the beginning. The real challenge would be figuring out how to right the wrongs of the past without causing more pain in the present. The following day, Nathaniel returned to St. Mary's Orphanage, carrying the weight of his mother's revelations. He found Jamal in the library, hunched over a book about modern architecture. The boy looked up as Nathaniel approached, offering a small smile that now carried new meaning. I brought something for you, Nathaniel said, placing a professional-grade sketchbook and set of drawing pencils on the table. I thought you might like better tools for your artwork. Jamal's eyes widened at the gift. These must have cost a lot, he said, running his fingers over the leather-bound sketchbook. I need to tell you something important, Nathaniel began, sitting down across from him. It's about your family, and mine. Over the next hour, Nathaniel carefully explained what he'd learned, watching Jamal's expression shift from curiosity to shock to uncertainty. He left out the more painful details about his grandfather's racism and threats, focusing instead on the core truth: they were uncle and nephew. Jamal remained quiet for a long time after Nathaniel finished speaking. Finally, he asked, "Does this mean you know where my dad is?" "Not yet," Nathaniel admitted. "But I'm looking for him." "What about your mother?" "The orphanage records show she brought you here 3 years ago." Jamal's face clouded. "Mom said she had to leave to keep me safe. She promised she'd come back when she could, but..." He trailed off, his fingers tightening around the new sketchbook. "Safe from what?" Nathaniel pressed gently. "I don't know exactly. There were men who kept coming to our apartment, demanding money. Mom worked 2 jobs, but it was never enough. One night, she woke me up, packed a bag, and we left. We stayed in different places for a while, then she brought me here." The information added another layer to the mystery. Why was Jamal's mother being threatened? Was it connected to their family's past? "I want you to know," Nathaniel said carefully, "that finding out we're family doesn't mean you have to change anything. This is a lot to process, and you might need time." Jamal nodded, then opened the sketchbook to its first blank page. He began drawing with the new pencils, his strokes precise and thoughtful. "When I draw," he said while working, "I sometimes imagine what my dad looks like. Now I guess he probably looks like you." They spent the next few hours together, Jamal drawing while Nathaniel shared stories about his life and business. The boy asked intelligent questions about investment banking, revealing a quick mind behind his artistic talents. "Would you like to see where I work sometime?" Nathaniel offered. "The building has some interesting architecture you might want to sketch." Jamal's face lit up, but then dimmed. "Are we allowed?" "I mean, with the orphanage rules and everything." "I'll speak with Mrs. Martinez. We'll do everything properly." Nathaniel hesitated, then added, "I want to be part of your life, Jamal, if you'll let me. Not to replace anyone, but to be there as family." "I'd like that," Jamal replied softly, adding final touches to his drawing, a detailed sketch of 2 people sitting across a library table, their similarities subtle but unmistakable. As Nathaniel prepared to leave, Jamal suddenly stood and hugged him. The gesture, unexpected and genuine, caught Nathaniel off guard. He hugged back carefully, aware of the trust being placed in him. Walking to his car, Nathaniel made 2 calls, one to his lawyer about establishing a trust for Jamal's education, and another to a private investigator specializing in finding missing persons. The search for Jamal's father, his half-brother, needed to begin immediately. What had started as a shocking discovery was evolving into something deeper, a chance to heal old wounds and build new bonds. But somewhere in the background, the question of why Jamal's mother had fled, and from whom, remained a troubling mystery. Over the next few weeks, Nathaniel became a regular presence at St. Mary's Orphanage. During one visit, he noticed Jamal organizing a group of younger children in the recreation room, helping them create a makeshift art class using donated supplies. "Everyone gets to make something," Jamal was saying, distributing paper and worn-down crayons. "It doesn't have to be perfect. Just draw what makes you happy." Nathaniel watched from the doorway as Jamal moved from child to child, offering encouragement and guidance. A small girl, no more than 6, frustrated with her drawing, was on the verge of tears. Jamal knelt beside her. "Look," he said, picking up a crayon. "Sometimes when I mess up, I turn it into something new. See this line you didn't like? Let's make it into a tree branch." Mrs. Martinez appeared beside Nathaniel. "He's always been like this," she said quietly. "Natural leader, especially with the younger ones. They look up to him." "What are the biggest challenges the orphanage faces?" Nathaniel asked, noticing the peeling paint and worn furniture. Mrs. Martinez sighed. "Where do I begin? The building needs repairs, we're understaffed, our educational resources are outdated. Most of these children are behind in school because they've missed so much classroom time. We do what we can, but..." Nathaniel studied the room more carefully. The computers in the corner were ancient models. The books on the shelves were falling apart. Even the heating system made concerning noises. "I want to organize a fundraiser," he decided. "Not just for donations, but to raise awareness about what these kids need." Over the next few days, Nathaniel threw himself into planning. He secured the grand ballroom at the Drake Hotel, contacted his business network, and hired event planners. Jamal contributed ideas, suggesting they display artwork from the children and share their stories. "People need to see us as real," Jamal explained, helping to select drawings for the exhibition. Not just sad cases to feel sorry for. The event preparations revealed deeper issues. When Nathaniel tried to arrange for new computers, he encountered bureaucratic resistance. The building inspector's report showed serious structural problems that had been ignored for years. Even getting approval for basic improvements required navigating endless red tape. "The system's designed to keep places like this barely functioning," Mrs. Martinez explained one afternoon, showing Nathaniel thick folders of denied grant applications. "We're expected to warehouse these children, not help them thrive." The fundraiser itself exceeded expectations. Chicago's elite turned out in force, drawn by the Brooks name. Jamal's artwork, displayed prominently, attracted particular attention from several gallery owners. Other children's stories and creations moved many guests to tears, and to open their checkbooks. But success brought unexpected problems. Local officials, embarrassed by the sudden spotlight on conditions at St. Mary's, began making unannounced inspections. They cited violations that had existed for years, threatening to shut down the facility unless immediate improvements were made. "They're punishing us for drawing attention to the problems," Mrs. Martinez said during an emergency meeting. "These children have nowhere else to go." Jamal, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "Maybe we could get the community involved. Not just rich people, but everyone in the neighborhood. Make it about all of us." His suggestion led to a community meeting in the orphanage's gymnasium. Local business owners, religious leaders, and residents came together. The children shared their experiences, with Jamal leading the younger ones in presenting their hopes for the future. "We're not asking for charity," Jamal told the crowd. "We're asking for a chance to be part of this community." The response was overwhelming. Local contractors offered to help with repairs. Teachers volunteered to tutor after school. A nearby tech company promised to update the computer lab. Watching Jamal coordinate with adult volunteers, Nathaniel felt pride mixed with concern. The boy showed remarkable resilience and leadership, but he shouldn't have to bear such responsibility at his age. And somewhere out there, his parents' situation remained unresolved. The private investigators' initial reports had turned up promising leads about Jamal's father, but also troubling information about his mother's recent past. The threats she'd fled from appeared to be connected to a larger criminal enterprise that preyed on vulnerable families. The improvements at St. Mary's drew unwanted attention from City Hall. One morning, Nathaniel arrived to find two men in suits speaking with Mrs. Martinez in her office. Their voices carried through the thin walls. "The zoning board has concerns about these unauthorized renovations," one man was saying. "And there are questions about the source of recent donations." Nathaniel entered without knocking. "I'm the source of those donations," he stated. "And I have all the necessary permits." The men turned, recognizing him immediately. The taller one, who introduced himself as James Wilson from the Department of Child Services, smiled thinly. "Mr. Brooks, this is highly irregular. Private citizens can't simply take over a state-licensed facility." "We're not taking over anything," Nathaniel countered. "We're providing resources the state has failed to provide for years." "There are protocols," the second man insisted. "Procedures. The children's safety dash. Safety." Jamal's voice cut through the tension. He stood in the doorway, shoulders squared. "Where was your concern for our safety when the heat didn't work last winter? Or when the roof leaked for months?" The officials shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Martinez placed a supportive hand on Jamal's shoulder, but he continued. "Every improvement here happened because people in our neighborhood cared enough to help. Where were your protocols then?" Wilson's face hardened. "Young man, this is an adult discussion about complex regulatory matters." "No," Nathaniel interrupted. "This is about people trying to maintain control over a broken system instead of fixing it. And Jamal has every right to speak about conditions that affect his life." The confrontation escalated into a series of meetings with higher-level officials. Nathaniel brought his lawyers, while community leaders rallied support. The children themselves, led by Jamal, prepared a presentation about life at St. Mary's, both before and after the recent changes. During one particularly tense session, an elderly woman who lived across from the orphanage stood up. "I've watched these children for years," she said. "Watched them play in a yard with broken equipment, watched them help each other when no one else would. Now I see them flourishing. You want to stop that? Shame on you." The bureaucratic resistance began to crumble under community pressure. But victory came at a price. The increased scrutiny meant more questions about each child's background, including Jamal's. "They're going to look into my records," Jamal told Nathaniel one afternoon, sketching nervously in his book. "What if they find out about Mom? About why we were running?" Nathaniel shared his concern. The private investigator had uncovered disturbing connections between the men who'd threatened Jamal's mother and several corrupt city officials. The same power structure they were fighting at St. Mary's might be linked to her disappearance. "We'll protect you," Nathaniel assured him. "But we need to know the whole story. Can you remember anything else about those men? Any names or details?" Jamal hesitated, then turned to a new page in his sketchbook. With remarkable precision, he drew a logo he'd seen on their jackets, a stylized eagle with distinctive markings. "They all wore this. And they called their boss, the commissioner, but I never saw him." The image sent a chill through Nathaniel. He recognized the logo from his business dealings. It belonged to a private security firm with connections throughout City Hall. Mrs. Martinez joined them, closing the office door. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. "Someone's been asking questions about Jamal. Not official channels, private investigators. They came by yesterday when you weren't here." The walls seemed to close in. What had started as a battle over orphanage conditions was expanding into something darker and more dangerous. Nathaniel realized they weren't just fighting bureaucracy, they were threatening a system of power that had operated unchecked for years. "We need to accelerate the search for your parents," he told Jamal. "But we also need to be careful. These people, they have influence." Jamal nodded, adding shadows to his drawing of the eagle. "Mom always said the truth would come out eventually. Maybe that's what they're afraid of." As winter settled over Chicago, the relationship between Nathaniel and his mother deteriorated further. Elizabeth Brooks began canceling their weekly dinners, communicating only through terse emails and her assistant. At the same time, her behavior grew erratic, making large donations to racial justice organizations, selling family heirlooms, and frequently changing her will. During one rare meeting at her townhouse, she handed Nathaniel a thick manila envelope. "These are letters," she said, her hands shaking. "From Thomas. Your grandfather never knew I kept them." "All these years," Nathaniel said, "you had these but said nothing." "I was a coward," she admitted. "But watching you with Jamal, you're doing what I should have done 30 years ago. Standing up to the system, fighting for what's right." The letters revealed more about Thomas Williams, Nathaniel's half-brother's father. He'd been a promising doctoral candidate in literature, writing about racial identity in American fiction. After the forced separation, he'd moved to Oakland, eventually becoming a high school principal. Meanwhile, Jamal was thriving despite the uncertain circumstances. His leadership at St. Mary's had evolved into organizing study groups, where older children helped younger ones with homework. He'd also started a weekend art program, teaching basic drawing techniques to anyone interested. "You remind me of Thomas," Elizabeth said during a rare visit to the orphanage. She watched Jamal work with a group of children, her eyes bright with unshed tears. He had that same way with people. That ability to bring out their best. Jamal's response to meeting his grandmother was cautious but kind. "Would you like to see some of my drawings?" he offered, showing her his portfolio. Elizabeth spent hours going through his work, pointing out similarities to artistic talents that had run in the Williams family. But the growing family bonds faced constant pressure. Anonymous complaints were filed about Nathaniel's frequent visits to St. Mary's. Questions were raised about his relationship with Jamal, suggesting improper motivations. The system seemed determined to sever their connection. "They're trying to isolate you," Mrs. Martinez warned one evening. "Make you vulnerable again." Nathaniel threw himself into legal preparations, working to establish permanent guardianship of Jamal while continuing the search for his parents. The process revealed how many children at St. Mary's had similar stories, families torn apart by poverty, prejudice, and powerful interests. "It's not just about me anymore," Jamal said during one of their discussions. Every kid here has a story that needs to be told. The pressure began affecting Nathaniel's business. Long-time clients mysteriously withdrew their accounts. Building inspectors appeared at his properties. Even his doorman reported strangers asking questions about his schedule. But for every attack, there was unexpected support. Other business leaders, impressed by Jamal's maturity and the positive changes at St. Mary's, stepped forward with help. Community organizations offered protection and resources. Elizabeth, despite her complicated feelings, used her social connections to counter the worst rumors. One evening, while helping Jamal with a particularly challenging math problem, Nathaniel realized how much they'd both grown. He'd learned to see beyond his privileged worldview, to understand the systemic barriers that separated families like his from families like Jamal's. And Jamal, despite his youth, had shown him what real strength looked like. "Sometimes I wonder," Jamal admitted, "if Mom and Dad would be proud of me now." "They would be," Nathaniel assured him. "But more importantly, you should be proud of yourself. You've helped change not just the orphanage, but everyone who knows you." As they worked, Elizabeth's words about Thomas echoed in Nathaniel's mind. The private investigator had recently reported a promising lead in Oakland. After 30 years, they might finally find Nathaniel's half-brother, Jamal's father. But would reopening those old wounds bring healing or more pain? The breakthrough came on a cold February morning. Nathaniel's private investigator, Sarah Chen, arrived at his office with a thick file and a determined expression. "I found him," she said without preamble. "Thomas Williams Jr., your half-brother. He's been living in Oakland for the past decade, working as a high school English teacher. Just like his father." The file contained photos, newspaper clippings, and detailed background information. Thomas Jr. had his father's academic brilliance and his mother's Brooks family features, the same ones that had drawn Nathaniel's attention to Jamal that first day at the orphanage. But the most startling discovery came buried in recent police reports. Thomas Jr. had filed multiple complaints about threats and harassment, specifically mentioning men wearing Eagle logos on their jackets. The same organization that had forced Jamal's mother into hiding had been pressuring his father. "There's more," Sarah continued. "Thomas Jr.'s wife, Jamal's mother, is Michelle Carter. She was a witness in a federal investigation into corruption at Chicago's Department of Child Services 5 years ago. The case fell apart when key witnesses disappeared. The pieces began falling into place. Michelle had fled with Jamal not just from debt collectors, but from people trying to silence her. Bringing Jamal to St. Mary's hadn't been abandonment, it was protection." "Have you made contact with Thomas?" Nathaniel asked. "No. Given the surveillance on him, I thought you should decide how to proceed." Nathaniel spent the night reviewing everything they'd learned. The corruption Michelle had witnessed apparently reached into the highest levels of city government. The same officials now trying to interfere at St. Mary's were likely part of the network she'd tried to expose. The next morning, he went to the orphanage to talk with Jamal. He found the boy in the art room, teaching younger children how to mix colors. "We found them," Nathaniel said quietly when they could speak privately. "Both your parents. They're alive, and they've been looking for you too." Jamal's hands trembled as he looked at the photos. "Dad looks like us," he whispered. "And Mom, she looks tired in these pictures." "They've been fighting the same people we are," Nathaniel explained. "Your mother discovered something dangerous, corruption that hurt families like yours. That's why you had to hide. Can we help them?" Jamal asked, his voice stronger. "It's risky. These people have power, money, influence." "So do you," Jamal pointed out. "And we have something they don't, the truth." Before they could discuss further, Mrs. Martinez burst into the room. "Michelle Carter is here," she said breathlessly. "She's in my office." Jamal froze. Nathaniel placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "It's your choice," he said. "We can wait if you're not ready." But Jamal was already moving. They found Michelle Carter pacing the small office, her face showing years of worry but her eyes sharp and determined. "My baby," she breathed when she saw Jamal. They collided in a fierce hug, both crying. When they finally separated, Michelle turned to Nathaniel. "Thank you for protecting him. For giving him what I couldn't." "Why now?" Nathaniel asked. "What's changed?" "Thomas found evidence," she explained. Documents proving the corruption, the connections, everything. But they know he has it. We need to move fast. The commissioner, Jamal said. He's part of this, isn't he? Michelle nodded grimly. He's the one who ordered the threats. Who forced me to run. But now we have proof of everything he's done, to us and to countless other families. That evening, they gathered in Nathaniel's penthouse. The only place they could be certain was secure. Michelle sat close to Jamal on the leather sofa, as if afraid he might disappear again. Nathaniel's mother, Elizabeth, hovered nervously by the windows, while Sarah Chin set up encrypted communications with Thomas Jr. in Oakland. Thomas appeared on the secure video link, his face a startling mirror of Nathaniel's own. I never knew I had a brother, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Or that my son was so close to finding his way back to us. The family reunion was bittersweet, conducted through screens and shadowed by danger. Thomas explained how he discovered financial records linking the commissioner, whose real name was Richard Harrison, to decades of corruption. The documents showed a systematic exploitation of Chicago's child welfare system, with Harrison and his associates profiting from keeping facilities like St. Mary's underfunded and vulnerable. They used the orphanages to launder money, Michelle added. Every denied grant, every delayed repair, the funds were being diverted. I found the pattern when I worked in the accounting department. Elizabeth stepped forward, her composure cracking. I should have fought harder, she told Thomas. Your father, our father, he was never wrong about what kind of man Harrison was. Mom, Nathaniel interrupted gently. We can't change the past. But we can fix the future. They worked late into the night, forming a plan. Thomas would fly to Chicago with the evidence. Sarah Chin had contacts in the FBI who could protect them once everything was in place. But timing would be crucial. Jamal, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. The fundraiser, he said. The one we're planning for St. Mary's next week. All the city officials will be there, including Harrison. It's the perfect time to expose everything. Michelle tensed. It's too dangerous. These people have been hurting families for decades, Jamal finished. Someone has to stop them. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Thomas arrived secretly, staying in a safe house arranged by Sarah. The evidence was organized, copies secured in multiple locations. Elizabeth used her social connections to ensure maximum media presence at the fundraiser. The night of the event, St. Mary's was transformed. Children's artwork covered the walls, telling stories of loss, hope, and resilience. Jamal's pieces held center stage, including a new series he'd created, depicting families torn apart and reunited. Harrison arrived late, flanked by his usual entourage. He moved through the crowd with practiced charm, unaware that federal agents were already in position. The moment came during Harrison's speech about protecting our city's children. Jamal stepped forward, Michelle and Thomas on either side of him. Nathaniel and Elizabeth stood behind them. A united family, finally ready to speak truth to power. Commissioner Harrison, Jamal said clearly into the sudden silence. I'd like you to meet my parents. The ones you tried to silence. What followed was a carefully orchestrated exposure of decades of corruption. As Harrison tried to leave, federal agents moved in. The evidence was irrefutable, the witnesses numerous. Years of carefully hidden crimes laid bare in a single evening. But it was more than just the arrest of corrupt officials. It was the beginning of real change for St. Mary's and similar institutions across the city. The gathered donors, moved by the truth and the courage of those who exposed it, pledged substantial, sustained support. Later that night, the family gathered again in Nathaniel's penthouse, this time without screens between them. Jamal sat surrounded by his parents, while Nathaniel and Elizabeth watched the city lights below. What happens now? Jamal asked. The celebration at Nathaniel's penthouse was interrupted by an unexpected visitor, James Wilson, the same Department of Child Services official who had tried to obstruct their work at St. Mary's. But this time, he carried a thick folder and a grave expression. There's something you all need to see, he said, placing the folder on Nathaniel's glass coffee table. Something Harrison kept hidden for decades. Inside was a document that changed everything, the original adoption papers from 1981. But they weren't for one child. They were for twins. Thomas wasn't just your half-brother, Wilson explained to Nathaniel. He had a twin sister. Harrison separated them deliberately, using one child to blackmail your mother and placing the other with a different family. The revelation stunned the room into silence. Elizabeth sank into a chair, her face ashen. 2 babies. But they told me there was only one. That's why Harrison was so desperate to keep everything hidden, Wilson continued. The corruption wasn't just about money. It was about power, the power to separate families, to control lives. Your family's story wasn't unique. There were others. Jamal, who had been examining the documents with his father, looked up. Then I might have cousins out there. Other family we don't know about. Before anyone could respond, Sarah Chen burst into the apartment. You need to see this, she said, turning on the news. Harrison was giving a statement from police custody, but his words weren't what anyone expected. The Brooks fortune, he was saying, was built on the separation of families. Nathaniel Brooks has no more right to it than any of the children his family helped displace. Under the original terms of the Brooks family trust, all descendants, regardless of race or circumstance, have equal claim to the inheritance. Nathaniel turned to his lawyer, who was already reviewing documents on his tablet. He's right. The lawyer confirmed. The trust's original language is explicit. If we acknowledge all the separated families, the entire fortune would need to be redistributed. A tense moment passed as everyone absorbed the implications. Harrison's final move wasn't just about revenge, it was an attempt to trigger a legal battle that would tear apart the newly reunited family. But Jamal broke the tension with a laugh. Is that supposed to be a threat? That we might have to share with more family members? Nathaniel joined in the laughter, understanding flowing between them. He still doesn't get it, does he? This was never about money. The next few hours were a flurry of activity. Legal teams were mobilized, not to fight the claims, but to help find and verify other affected families. Elizabeth provided all the information she had about other separations she'd witnessed. Thomas and Michelle reached out to advocacy groups they'd worked with over the years. We'll need to establish a foundation, Nathaniel decided. Not just to distribute the money, but to help reunite families and change the system that allowed this to happen. As dawn broke over Chicago, the family gathered at the window. The city was waking up to news of Harrison's arrest and the shocking revelations about decades of systematic family separation. But in the penthouse, a different kind of awakening was taking place. You know what this means? Jamal said, sketching quickly in his book. Our family tree isn't just getting bigger, it's getting stronger. Every person Harrison tried to keep apart is another branch growing back together. He showed them the drawing, a massive tree with roots deep in the city soil, its branches reaching out in all directions, with small figures holding hands among the leaves. That's our real inheritance, Thomas said, putting an arm around his son. Not money or property, but the truth. And the chance to make things right. Nathaniel looked at his newly expanded family, his half-brother, sister-in-law, nephew, mother, and the promise of more connections to come. Harrison's final attempt at destruction had instead created an opportunity for even greater healing. So, he said, who's ready to start finding the rest of our family? The sun rose over Chicago, illuminating a city where old powers were falling and new possibilities were taking root. The story that began with one boy's drawing in an orphanage had grown into something far larger, a movement to reconnect all the families that had been torn apart, and to ensure it never happened again.